there are some interesting aspects to the whole business about food addiction. For instance, somebody will say, well, Dr. Esselstyn, if you start this with a patient, won't you start it really kind of gradually, slowly? Don't really rush them into this. Absolutely not. Cold turkey. Why? What's the rationale for that? Why don't you just ease them along? Well, I think this kind of thing with addiction was learned years ago with cigarettes. The person who says, I'm going to cut down 1 cigarette a day, the likelihood of that success is close to 0. And I think the important thing here, if they have an addiction, is to make sure that they get the education and understand the scientific mechanisms of how they create the disease. Now let's just say what happens is best explained, I think, by a study at the Monell Chemical Institute in Philadelphia, where they took 3 different groups of patients at different levels of fat. 34% fat, typical American level, 20%, significant reduction, and then around 11% where we are. One of those groups at the end of 12 weeks has now lost their craving for fat. Which one? Right, the one at 11%. Because the problem with fat addiction is you can downregulate the fat receptor. But if I try to do this slowly, and you say somebody's good all week long and then they belly up to the trough on the weekend and really hit it hard, then the fat receptor never gets downregulated. So they're in this constant state of misery and denial, and then your chances for recidivism are so much higher. And I think that's, and we know that's the way it works with sugar as well. And we find that getting people to really get the knowledge, get the understanding, appreciate through education exactly what our goals are here, and they can lick that addiction. I don't have these restrictions for people who don't yet have cardiovascular disease, but if you were to ask me what is the way I think that America should be eating, it is obviously plant-based, because what we're doing now is we have a way of eating that simply is a sort of a slow springboard to everybody developing chronic illness. How many people do you know of who are 80 who aren't taking pills, who haven't had some sort of illness? Right? And it's, that doesn't have to be. Obviously, we're all going to perish. But when we get to that time, it's nice, instead of having 15 years of drooling out of your side of your face in a wheelchair, having had strokes, which is absurd, you get to what we call the rectangularization of life's curve. You live a healthy life out somewhere between 87 and 93 or 4, and then you're sick a short time. You don't cost society a bundle of money, and the illness is prompt. The family doesn't go through anything, and you've had a wonderful life, and you don't end up suffering for years on end. And it's kind of exciting as we begin to look at this a little bit more objectively. Now, obviously, if the food companies really settle in and know what we're doing, instead of fighting us, because that doesn't really prove a lot, instead of having people grow meat and grow dairy, which are destroying our health, those same people can grow plants. A little change in their expertise, but that's where the ultimate answers will be. I mean, right now, for instance, it's just absurd with all the subsidies that go to farmers who are growing what? Corn and soybeans for livestock. To perpetuate this problem. And I mean, and when you look at the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, every 5 years, they make this dietary guidelines, food plate or pyramid, and everybody who is an officer in the USDA has previously been an officer in the food industry, the cattlemen's industry, the dairy industry, the pork board, the egg board, and obviously, I mean, they're going to defend their industry. And so for them to put out a food pyramid that has food on it that if eaten by America will make millions perish, the question is about how you can motivate younger people to begin to think about eating this way. Well, obviously, the natural thought that comes to mind is, how do we get into schools? Because right now, people in schools are just eating just atrociously. I mean, it is so unhealthy. And all these people are going to be, within the next 10, 15 years, 20 years, they're going to be the next group of patients. So how do you get them to change the way they're eating? Because all of them eating at home are probably the same way that's rather dangerous. And I think you've got to have enough of a commitment in the school to give them the education, to give them the awareness, the knowledge, because I think it's really inappropriate to underestimate the American public and is willing to change when they get the knowledge. For instance, I can recall when the smoking business all came out. Who was going to change? Well, it went from 40 million to 20 million. That means that 20 million Americans got the word. And finally, obviously, that made it a whole number of public laws that made it very challenging to smoke as well. Then you look at something like seatbelts. When seatbelts first came out, oh, what a nuisance. You had to clamp these on and clamp them off. And suddenly it became absolutely so apparent that these seatbelts were saving millions of lives. And everybody pretty well likes to buckle up now. And the same thing with HIV and AIDS. People got more and more aware of and savvy about that. I think we tend to underestimate the public's ability to change if we're willing to give them the science. And right now they are very easily, they can say, well, wait a minute, one doctor says this, another doctor says this, I read a book that said this, I read a book that said that. I think what you can ask them is to try to look at where the peer-reviewed scientific literature is. That's the greatest likelihood that that particular individual has been held accountable by a jury of their peers. Now, as far as getting young men into this, if they realize that down the line eating these foods was responsible for the high percentage of erectile dysfunction that occurs, I mean, you'd end this in a heartbeat, or you'd achieve success. So, really the foundation for which this whole revolution can take place is from a knowledge base of irrefutable science. And really right now, the totality of the evidence is so clear. Because right now, I mean, today, as I said, present cardiovascular medicine cannot halt the disease, it can't cure the disease, it'll never end the epidemic. And truly, I think we're at a point now where, as far as I'm concerned, it is absolutely unconscionable for a physician to treat a patient with cardiovascular illness who does not mention this option. I think what you feel is an enormous wellspring of satisfaction to know that suddenly, again, it's such powerful confirmation that you constantly are seeing renewed of the affirmation of the science. And but for me to tell you that there's any one patient that I cared more about than another that gave me a, well, I think some of the original group were kind of exciting. I mentioned the gentleman with the pain in his leg. That was a eureka moment for us because he was the very first who suddenly we recognized that we could turn this around. And but I hope it's a eureka moment for everybody that I end up being able to influence to make them feel better. I think I mentioned in our study that 89% were adherent. So that meant that there were 21 patients out of the 198 who were non-adherent. And they had a miserable time of it, with several of them died, had to have more procedures, more stents, more bypasses, and so forth. Yeah. And I look back at that group and I wondered, what could I have changed to throw the hook in that particular individual? Maybe a little bit more time on the endothelium, because I remember one of them ended up having a heart transplant. And I mean, come on, if he'd known that when he started this crazy parade of cardiovascular disease that he would end up with a heart transplant, do you think he wouldn't change? Yeah, they just somehow don't see what's coming at the end of the tunnel. But you can have some people who are significantly overweight who yet have not yet developed their cardiovascular issue. But being overweight or being carrying a significant additional amount of fat poundage is brutal. I mean, it makes you so much more vulnerable to everything from hypertension, cancer, diabetes, vascular disease. I mean, it's just crazy. And it's sad, but I think I can say this honestly, probably 95% of America has no idea how to eat. Who taught them? Grandma? No, it's the television that's teaching them. So we've really got to educate people, and that's an enormous task. But again, here come the schools. Show them what are the foods that you can eat where you don't injure yourself. Yeah. Don't eat out of a box or a bag or a can. Eat the produce. Eat the food as grown. Colin Campbell's a remarkable scientist and really a wonderful human being and a treasured friend. We got to know each other when it was back in 1991 when I'd been at this then for about 5 or 6 years, 7 years, and I decided it was time to let the world know about this. So I put together a thing called the First National Conference on the Elimination and Prevention of Cardiovascular Disease. And it was just about that time that I was trying to put together the faculty for this meeting, that I read an article in the New York Times about this scientist from Cornell who had done the Grand Prix of all nutrition studies. It was about Colin's study in China. I said, well, my God, here's this big, important professor from Cornell. I think he'd ever talk with a general surgeon from the clinic. So I did what I always do, and I just picked up the phone. We had a marvelous chat, and he came on board, and at that conference, he was just terrific. I mean, he totally was into this, totally supportive, and that's the way he's continued to be so loyal and so generous ever since. And that was now 1991, so that easily is over 20 years ago.